So the way that we're going to run today's event is our three speakers are going to sort of hold forth for sort of 5 to 10 minutes each. I will then sort of call upon my sort of prerogative and power as moderator to sort of run a question or two past each of them before turning things over to you, our audience, to pose questions via the chat box, please. I will reiterate this in, 30, 40 minutes time when we're sort of really deeply enmeshed in the question and answer component. Nevertheless, please extremely briefly introduce yourself before posing a question in the chat box, and we'll take it from there. So our three speakers today are Albert Mully, who's the head of policy at the Centre on Armed Groups. He's a conflict mediation and peacebuilding expert who has spent much of the past 2 decades working in countries in which this sort of non-state armed group and climate environmental response nexus is playing out. And he leads much of the centre's work in that space. Samira Gaid is the founder and director of Balkis Insights, a Somalia-based think tank dedicated to advancing peace and security in the Horn. In the context of this chat, most importantly, she led in collaboration with the Centre on Armed Groups, a bunch of new research in Somalia looking at how climate risks and impacts intersect with armed group governance. And then Dina Al-Mamoun is the Yemen country director of Civic, previously working as country director for Geneva Coal, also working for UNDP Yemen and a kind of who's who of other extraordinarily important organizations. And again, most importantly, within the context of this event, she led research on climate change and armed groups in Yemen, working again in collaboration with the Centre on Armed Groups. And I'm Peter Schwartzstein. I'm your moderator today. I'm by background an environmental journalist and researcher affiliated with the Stimson Center and the Center for Climate and Security. On that note, over to you, Albert, please.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks everyone for joining. Really excited to see so much interest in this topic. So as Peter said, I'm the head of policy at the Centre on Armed Groups. We're an independent, non-governmental organization registered in Geneva, Switzerland, but we work across 35 different countries. And we mainly focus on 3 pillars of work: research. Basically, we try to do as much novel and forward-looking research on armed groups and on communities living under armed group control for different reasons, ranging from more academic work to more policy-focused work. We also, in our dialogue work, we create safe spaces and bring together armed groups, communities, policymakers, donors, NGOs together to discuss lessons learned and strategies for engaging with armed groups and kind of linking armed groups directly with other stakeholders. And in our advisory work, we provide advisory support to different entities, from donors to local implementers who want to engage with armed groups through different types of approaches. This work has really been something that we've been really excited to do. I think most of the people on this call will be familiar with the fact that, I would say over the last 5 to 10 years, there's been increasing interest in climate security and the links between climate and conflict. And it's very encouraging to see the amount of research that's been happening in this space, the amount of on-the-ground programming that's been happening in this space, increasingly bringing together cross-disciplinary approaches, and bringing together people who focus on the climate side of things and people who are on the peace-building side to try to find peace-positive, win-win approaches to strengthening climate adaptation and resilience in areas affected by conflict, but doing so in a way that also might maximize peace outcomes. And while that's been very positive, we've noticed an important gap, which is while a lot of this work is happening, it really, most of it has focused, understandably because of the security risks and some of the political sensitivity around this, but it has focused on issues of intercommunal conflict, bringing together, trying to address the climate drivers of intercommunal conflict and localized conflict. And often it hasn't really looked at what this means in areas that are a lot more kind of contentious, which are areas that are usually controlled and influenced by armed groups areas that are normally beyond state control, or where the state is a minor actor or the state's authority is being contested. And so I think, for us, there's a significant risk here that ignoring the fact that armed groups control so vast territories in a lot of conflict-affected states. As the ICRC recently revealed in their reporting, more than 200 million people live in areas controlled or contested by armed groups. We think that the way that climate action and climate financing is done is very state-centered, and therefore there's a risk that this will leave behind these communities. So we really wanted to shine the spotlight on trying to unpick some of the complicated, politically sensitive questions around how can we do more climate adaptation and climate resilience work in areas that are beyond state control, in these contested spaces. And so this is where we started this bit of research. We hope to continue, but to date, we've been able to do some really interesting work in Somalia and Yemen, which Samira and Dina will speak to. But I just wanted to set the scene and say that, the main purpose here is to basically understand how do different types of armed groups approach climate change? How do they understand the challenges of climate change and climate vulnerabilities and climate impacts? How do they see their role, not just as military security actors, which is how they tend to be seen, but as governance actors, as social actors, as economic actors? How do they see their role in the governance of natural resources, of the natural environment, and in the management and response to climate change and climate hazards? And what does this all mean for working in those areas, for all the different stakeholders internationally and nationally and locally who want to work on strengthening climate action interventions in areas that are under the control or influence of armed groups? So thank you again for joining. I hope you find the emerging findings of our research interesting, and that we can have an interesting discussion on the policy implications as well.
Thank you, Albert. And just a quick note to everybody else, please, over the next period, as sort of questions crop up in your heads, please do begin to put them in the chat box, and we can amass those and tap Albert and Samira and Dina's expertise later in this session. Samira, please tell us a bit about the research you've done in Somalia.
Yes, thank you so much. Thanks for having me, of course, and welcome everyone who's made the time to log in. I'm with Balqis, and Balqis does quite a bit of work on armed groups and the security sector in Somalia. But on this specific research that we took on with the Center on Armed Groups, it looks at something that is quite, like mentioned by Albert, underexamined. The role that Al-Shabaab plays as a governance actor in large parts of South and Central Somalia, and how it shapes communities' vulnerability and their resilience. I think when you do get a chance to read the paper, you will see that Al-Shabaab, even if it's a primary governance actor, its impact on how it manages environmental challenges and climatic shocks is quite different from how the government and the state-centric approaches work. And I just wanted to mention some of our key findings, 3 specifically. One was how the group itself frames this climate shocks, the climate change religiously. It frames them as, leadership, attributes it to divine will, qadr, in Somali, and that it's a divine punishment to the community's failings. People are not being good, they're not being religious enough. So for them, it's more deliberate to depoliticize this hardship and their role in the hardship that the people are facing. The second key finding that I just wanted to quickly mention is that environmental governance by them is more about strategic control, not really concern about communities that live under them. They do 3 things mainly, which is banning of tree cutting, they ban charcoal production, and then they strict control over access to grazing land and water resources. So this, could appear to sometimes the community that they are, thinking about the environment and thinking about climate change more strategically. But when you look at it, it's specifically linked to taxation. Charcoal production is tolerated if taxes are paid, and clan dynamics come into play when it comes to access to land or access to water resources. So it's more about power and resources rather than really the communities that they are living with. And then the third part is that the impact of Al-Shabaab governance is largely negative when you look at it over the long term, because communities are not getting more resilient. In fact, they are really suffering under Al-Shabaab rule because while they could have coped if they were allowed to engage with either the state or development partners or humanitarian actors, Al-Shabaab tightens that relationship. It tightens resource control, resources. It takes more from the communities during this time. So it means that communities are less able to cope. And so I think this work is very important. First of all, because we're looking at an aspect that's not looked at. It's something that is assumed that the state will cover or look into. But as Albert mentioned, these areas are very difficult to access. And so I think just understanding that we have to have a more nuanced approach in areas where there's armed group control, I think that's the most important output to me of this research work. But happy to get into more detail as we go into it.
Thank you, Samira. No, I will certainly, I think we'll be keen to hear a sort of few more details later on. But in the meantime, Dina, I mean, Yemen is a country in which governance, as in Somalia, is extremely fragmented. It's also a country in which climate and environmental risks are severe and in many instances worsening. Could you please sort of tell us a little bit about your research in Yemen and this sort of complex interplay and how it plays out there?
Thank you very much. So yes, I mean, absolutely. I mean, we all know about how climate change has affected Yemen, how it's now the most water scarce country. What we have seen, though, that in addition to all of these factors, that also the climate conflict dynamics are there and very visible in Yemen. And this is, of course, taking place amidst fragmentation in security forces, in armed actors, and also division in the country. So we have areas that are under the control of the Houthis, and how that is important is because many of for example, in cities such as Taiz, the water sources are coming from areas under the control of the Houthis, but most of the population is actually in areas controlled by the government. That in itself creates a dynamic where climate change is interacting directly with how people live on a daily basis. And that also that climate change and water also becomes a leverage, a bargaining chip in relation to the different armed actors and their involvement with communities. Here also wanted to mention that what we have seen also is that security forces have told us that, children, instead of going to school, they're going to fetch water. I was in Taiz some months ago. I was just in a restaurant, and out of the blue, a lady came to me and said, "Where do you get water from?" This is real, genuine concerns that people going on about their daily lives are struggling with. This is also not just in relation to Taiz. Of course, we know in Ma'rib, for example, the population in Ma'rib was not more than 150,000. Following the conflict, we now have this large-scale displacement in the government of Ma'rib, reaching, now we have millions of people. Now, where do they go? Where do they stay? They have no option but to actually put their tents in areas that have been where the floods normally go. With the increase in floods, they're now in the path of floods, basically. That's where they find themselves. All of this is also, in addition to all of this, we also have the dynamics between IDP communities and host communities as well. The tension between them, the competition over resources have meant that security forces in government of Yemen controlled areas, while they're not necessarily eager to be involved, they find themselves almost drawn into the issues around climate conflict and to help people, rescue operations, and reluctantly, they have now become more involved in the implementation of rules around not being in certain paths or not, for example, dig wells, etc. But this is also, these are very few actions that are taken haphazardly. Then there's not necessarily a government policy. The state institutions are in collapse because of the conflict. So therefore, they almost find themselves having to respond, having to step into to roles that are not necessarily they're geared for. And they say openly to us that they do not have the expertise to necessarily deal with these conflicts. In addition to that, of course, there's tensions around tribal settings where conflicts are taking place between different communities, and the security forces may belong to one community or the other. So therefore, they become part of the conflict as well, as unwittingly as this might be. And here I also wanted to mention that in previous years, when we've looked into climate conflict in Yemen, we have seen that it is the second biggest cause of death and injury after the conflict. And that's, I think, speaks volumes. I'm happy to stop here, or I can continue to sort of elaborate on that.
No, I mean, Dina, I would love it if you could elaborate a little bit more on, on really what this sort of looks like on the ground.
So on the ground, what we've seen is that there isn't the awareness that climate change and climate conflict are linked. So there is very clear understanding of climate change. For example, people tell us that in the past they would dig 200 meters to find waters. Now they dig 2,000 meters and they can't find water. So they can see that. And they can see how growing of qat is linked to the water scarcity that the country is experiencing. But at the same time, we don't necessarily see the urgency around programming to do with climate change. In addition to that, I think in relation to climate conflict in particular, there is even less awareness around how it is one of the biggest causes of injury and death in the country, and it is likely to be worse. Having said all of this, I think where we see communities actually step in is like the mediation. So the mediation efforts that have taken place in places such as Taiz, this is very much largely led by civil society organizations. And this is, I think, where we see perhaps a glimmer of hope within all of this, that although not everyone is seeing the link, we have seen that water mediation in particular in Taiz has had positive impact. And this leaves us, I think, the opportunity to think around how we can work in relation to climate conflict in particular to ensure that when security forces are involved, they're involved in a way that is conflict sensitive and that does not cause further damage to community relations. And then also the recognition by the state itself that climate conflict is one of the biggest concerns in the country. The other thing I wanted to mention here is that, of course, again, the role of the international community in terms of INGOs leading work around climate change and climate conflict, adaptabilities and response. I think that is also another area where we see big gaps in relation to climate change.
Thank you, Dina. So I think, we're certainly going to want to come back to the sort of more detailed components of the research. But for a moment, I would love for us to sort of pull out a little bit and sort of look at the broader picture. So actually, a question that I would love to direct to all three of you, but perhaps starting with Albert, is how current dynamics with the war in and around Iran and the pretty enormous consequences that is having for energy security, food security, and an array of other dynamics, how that is likely to contribute to this messy interplay, this sort of messy dance between climate and environmental impacts, climate and environmental responses, and non-state groups and their capacity to sort of manage this series of pressures. So, Albert, what do you think kind of this rather liminal, rather terrifying moment means for these forces and phenomena going forward?
Really interesting, complicated question, Peter. I think I think several things. So the return to kind of interstate conflict, we're seeing conflict that, especially what we're seeing now in Iran and the war in Gaza and in Ukraine, a lot of it is being done, through the air. It's done by drones. It's missile strikes. So the environmental destruction that is being done, destruction of gas and oil facilities, pollution of shrapnel and other kind of unexploded ordnances and things like that. I think that is having in itself a direct impact, and I think we saw in Yemen, a lot of the respondents talked about the fact that, a lot of landmines and other kind of UXO unexploded ordnance are cut up in the floods, and that increases the risks of to communities. And so I think, there is a direct impact on the environment, and that creates in itself a question of who's going to deal with that. In areas controlled by armed groups, will armed groups have the capability and bandwidth and interest in doing that? As we saw in Somalia, if it's not in their interest, they probably wouldn't do it. If it is in their interest, if it's a way to, to show legitimacy or improve their authority, they might. I think also the increase in conflict globally is creating areas of opportunity for armed groups to proliferate, to expand their authority. And so I think this creates, and a lot of people have been talking about these geopolitical shifts and what they mean for mediation. But I think that it does also pose a question of what does it mean for climate action in areas, if we're seeing more areas controlled by or contested by armed groups. But a return to a kind of realpolitik where I think we're less able to look at armed groups as governance actors, but only as a kind of security threat. And I think to us, the main thing here, as difficult as it can be, I think from a normative perspective for people, we need to remember that if you just treat an armed group as a security threat and all you're trying to do is eliminate them, if they control significant portions of your territory, you're basically just ignoring the potential there for doing things in those areas, and therefore missing opportunities to think creatively about how you might do that. Even in a place where you have an extremist group like Al-Shabaab, are there entry points through diaspora funding or through different clans that have some level of connection with the group who can shape this? And can you have a government developing a nationally an NDC that talks about things like reforestation or changing land use practices when the government doesn't, how is it going to set targets for areas that it isn't controlling? But it's also very difficult for donors and climate funds to come in and talk to governments about this in a way that's open. So I think the challenge for us here, and why we think this research is important, is to really understand these dynamics on the ground, not just the actual climate challenges, but how they intersect with and overlap with and shape the more political conflict side of things, but also governance. And then how can we think imaginatively, but also realistically about what can be done feasibly, and how can we realistically not necessarily engage with armed groups, but in some cases navigate armed group governance to be able to achieve those objectives.
Thank you, Albert. And Samira, I really have the same question in a Somali context. I mean, even before the events of the last month, Somalia was, of course, a country reeling from drought, a country in which food security is a sort of ever-present concern for so much of the population. What does everything that's going on at the moment mean for that kind of this balance of power between Al-Shabaab, the federal government, and a range of other actors in the country?
Yeah, thanks. I think this is such a good question because we're also currently working on what the impact of the Iran war is on the Horn of Africa, and even specifically Somalia. And I think because this is quite recent for me, the greatest impact has been economically. Of course, almost 80% of the goods that come into Somalia are imported, come through the sea, and then with the Strait of Hormuz being blocked off, and then nothing coming through the Red Sea. I think it's really challenging costs on the ground. We found that business people are already hiking up prices in anticipation of the food prices and the prices of goods going up. We found that fuel went up 100 and something percent already, like days after the beginning of the war. So this in real life means that people who survive on $1 a day are going to have to make to try and get much more. And then the second challenge that is also coming out because of the war is that most of the Somali diaspora, some of the Somali diaspora, not most of them, are in the Gulf, and with the the economic challenges that they're going to be facing, their remittances, that is really a lifeline to Somalia, is going to go down. And so that's the second challenge. And then the third one is just even the international community's attention to what's going on in Somalia. You mentioned that we've constantly had these climatic shocks and these challenges, but at this moment we're undergoing a severe drought. People are losing their animals. People are having to migrate to cities. There's IDPs are moving to the main cities, and the challenge that we're having right now is there was already cuts to this kind of aid and humanitarian efforts. There's Al-Shabaab in these territories that's blocking access, and then now you get this attention shift to the Middle East. Of course, it was already shifting to Gaza and Ukraine, but then this now takes everyone's attention. And so there's not much attention on what's happening in Somalia. And this, not just Somalia, I would say in the Horn, Sudan, also facing severe humanitarian crisis. So these are some of the impacts that we're going to see on the ground, at least in the immediate term.
Thank you. And I mean, what does this mean for Yemen? I mean, I guess we have a lot of the same, or at least a variation of the same challenges: intense food security, fast intensifying and ever more regular environmental and climate shocks, extraordinary donor fatigue with the conflict that, of course, has been going on for more than a decade. And I mean, I guess one of the real tragedies, I mean, among so many emerging from the current crisis, is that this is just more time, more months in a best case scenario in which climate and environmental issues will be pushed that bit further down the priority list. I mean, yeah, what does this mean in Yemen?
Absolutely, and also in addition to that, that the sort of the scenario, the war scenario, that is even sort of like engulfing the entire country, is more present now because of what's happening in Iran specifically. So we are looking at this as a possibility, a very likely possibility, that Yemen could see another round of big, intense conflict. But here also I wanted to mention that the concern is also because, like I said earlier, some of the water, sort of the wells, etc., they're in areas controlled by the other party in the conflicts, let's say the Houthis, and then the population in the bigger part of the population areas controlled by the government, and then of course the risk of further displacement, etc. And we have seen that in Yemen specifically, I think we have had many UN agencies budgets cut by almost 60%. That's even before any conflict has started, with more vigor. So we now have this situation that it's what is looming is quite scary. And then also, I think in addition to that, we need to see how we can ensure that issues around water, mines, etc., all of that can be as depoliticized as possible. How can we make sure, for example, that mediation around water continues even if the conflict can the tensions around the conflict rises? I think that is going to be one of the bigger challenges. And here I think the reliance on community protection groups in particular is quite important, because they are the ones who operate at the very local level. They are the ones who have links and connections with the different parties to the conflict, the armed groups that are in the areas, or the armed actors in the area, that they can actually ensure that some level of negotiations, of discussion can continue even at the height of conflict, because we have seen that they have been able to mobilize at times of very high intensity conflict to exchange bodies, to have release of detainees, etc. So the question is, how can we ensure that whatever channels exist for mediation can continue to exist vis-a-vis climate change and conflict?
Thank you, Dina. I'm going to pose another round of questions while waiting for a few others to emerge in the chat box. I mean, thank you for the question, Thomas. I'm absolutely certainly very keen to get our panelists' thoughts on that, and equally very possibly to sort of have you chime in and give your take on how Oxfam could potentially contribute in some of these scenarios. But Albert, a question for you. And here I want to go to the sort of action adaptation component of all of this. And that's, I mean, to what extent should climate adaptation actors, those who are implementing partners, those who are donors, and an array of others, engage with armed groups in places like Somalia and places like Yemen to reach vulnerable populations in areas beyond state control? I mean, as you alluded to previously, it's a very delicate, very complex dance. And as we have seen in various parts of the world, the very act of working with non-state actors can contribute to their legitimacy and, as a consequence, inadvertently or not, undermine the perceived legitimacy of federal or central government actors that bit further. So, yeah, I mean, how should we, the sort of collective international community, if that term still has any use, go about thinking about this equation?
Yeah, good question. So I think the first thing is to really kind of to accept in our heads that there are different types of armed groups, and that, you know, some of the labels we apply to them, or some of the normative assumptions being made around an armed group being illiberal or extremist automatically means you shouldn't engage with them. I think a lot of the practice over the last 10 years has shown that many governments have been willing to engage with these armed groups. A lot of organizations engage with even the most extremist armed groups to be able to deliver, for example, humanitarian aid. So even though it's often talked about in a way that reinforces this notion that some groups are beyond the pale, I think if we really take practice, people have been pragmatic, and organizations and governments have been pragmatic. So I think that's one extreme, is to try to push people to understand that, you know, you need to have a calibrated approach to different types of armed groups, and that calibrated approach can potentially include armed groups that are extremist, but that engagement in the areas controlled by those extremist armed groups may need to be a little different. And I think the interesting thing about the research here is that, you know, the groups in Yemen and the groups in Somalia that we're looking at are very different. So in Yemen, we didn't directly look at the Houthis. We looked at kind of government, different types of armed groups that are to different degrees linked to the government and influenced by different external actors, one of which is the government, some or more directly controlled by or fall under kind of the command and control structures of the government, but others have more operational authority. And so the idea here is, you know, what is the government's relationship to the armed group, but also what is the armed group's relationship to the international community and to NGOs? So, you know, I think the research that Dina and her team did shows that a lot of the armed groups in government-controlled areas, even ones that are operationally relatively independent from the government, are open to and work with NGOs to do some of this climate work, right? But as Dina said, some of them are having to, in areas where there is a gap, some of these armed group members are having to themselves respond to climate things, which isn't their area of expertise. So it sounds like a kind of a cop-out response, but I think really doing the right analysis and understanding what are the different types of armed groups in a territory, in a country, what are the relationships to the state at different levels, because you might have a federal government that is completely against an armed group, but then you'll find local level mayors or councillors who are willing to talk to the armed group, who have social links to the armed group through clan dynamics and things like that. And I really then use that understanding to look creatively at options that you can have. And I think this kind of links to Thomas's question around, you know, like humanitarian organizations that do this engagement with armed groups for humanitarian access. I think there probably are a lot of lessons that can be discerned for climate actors as well. But yeah, I think the big question is, how do we get climate funds, the World Bank and others who support a lot of this work, to feel comfortable to do some of this in areas that are beyond state control? That often then means getting the state on board to some extent. That often might mean looking at different financing models and things like localization, working through communities themselves might be part of the answer. But then, how do you do that? You still might need armed group permission. So to what extent do you engage directly with the armed group versus indirectly? Those are all questions that will depend on the nature of the armed group and its relationship with the state and with external actors.
Thank you. No, it's a hard and in many ways deeply unfair question. I apologize for posing it. And it's the sort of question that makes me rather happy that for most of my career thus far, I've been sort of more on the identifying the nature of the challenge side of the ledger rather than actually having to come up with solutions, many of which are difficult and profoundly sort of unsatisfying, no matter which kind of side you end up plumping for. But Samira, I mean, this is a question that actually picks up from a number of the points that Albert made, which is, climate and environmental stresses, as we've briefly discussed, both hurt and help non-state groups. I mean, on the one hand, they are weakening many kind of central governments. They are driving dissatisfaction with state actors through the ways in which they contribute to state failures in infrastructure, in water, in affordable food, and an array of other ways, thereby kind of creating a series of openings that non-state actors have often rather expertly harnessed. But of course, they also pose, as you and Dina have discussed in Somali and Yemeni contexts, they also pose governance challenges for these non-state groups when or if they assume control. I mean, are the likes of Al-Shabaab aware of this sort of double-edged sword? Do they understand the ways in which they can simultaneously benefit and suffer from these phenomena?
Yeah, I would say, based on what we found, definitely Al-Shabaab does demonstrate this operational awareness of how these climatic shocks are serving their interests, and even if they don't frame it as such internally. So on the help side, I would say they understand that these crises create governance vacuums and they deepen the community's dependence on them. They treat these droughts and floods that occur in areas that they control as political opportunities. They form these high-profile emergency committees. They bring in media, to film the aid distribution. They broadcast it on their radio and social media. They're very good at this communications. We had a former member that we interviewed. Tell us clearly that they view this as not just humanitarian crises but political events to push their agenda forward. So I would say in that way they do see how this work to help them. But on the hard side, I would say it's not very clear. They do strain their resources. People are moving out of Al-Shabaab territory, especially men who are able to contribute to the insurgency or are able to contribute economically. So that does put a strain on how they collect their resources. They can't deliver basic emergency responses, so they're finding themselves getting into clashes with the communities or being unable to provide for the communities that are supposedly helping. And the narrative framing that we've discussed, attributing it to divine will, it's a tool of managing this specific risk to say that this is outside of our control. It's something that is ordained by God. So they work on it in that way, and they frame it as not as a governance failure, but as a divine will. So I would say they're more attuned to the opportunities than the risks. They have to manage the risks as they go, so their narrative works to mitigate those risks.
Thank you, Samira. So I'm going to pose one last question to Dina before turning to the excellent questions that you are now starting to dump in the chat box. By all means, please continue, and also please remember to sort of just add who precisely you are. We're all sort of just keen to understand the mix of folks that we have in the room. But Dina, I mean, if natural resources like water and like arable land have become kind of sources of leverage in the Yemeni conflict and in so many others, I mean, can environmental governance ever be truly neutral? I mean, is the increasing role of security actors in regulating these resources a necessary survival strategy? I mean, how can we unpack this sort of complex matrix?
Yes, so really in terms of the security forces that are in Yemen, first of all, their understanding differs. So the understanding on climate and their role differs from one group to another. So that in itself, I think, determines what role they then have. The other point is that the reluctance, or they see themselves as stepping in to do something that is emergency, to support a situation that is getting out of hand. So here, I think, we've got two types of armed actors: those who see it as an opportunity to have an important role and politicize it and use as much as they can of that, and there are others who see it as, we need to step in, and they step in to do the basic minimum. They do not necessarily see it as an opportunity to do more, or to try to leverage that more. But at the same time, with those who do not see a bigger role for themselves, they do want to see the government stepping in. But at the same time, we do not see that the state institution being able to step in. And what the reality is that we're going to have these armed actors being with us for a long time, with a role that needs to be somehow harnessed so that they can play their role fully. And here also wanted to mention what Albert mentioned earlier around how we engage with them is crucial. Because if, and regardless of their relationship with the government, and I think this is another conversation that needs to be had with governments, is that whether we like it or not, these armed actors are there to stay, and they're there for a long time while the state sort of rebuilds its institutions. And with that, I think it's a question about how we identify the opportunity and how we can support those armed actors, and so that they actually understand their role, and also when they step in, they don't cause harm as well, because that's again the other concern that we have in relation to their involvement when they're not fully aware of the impact that they can have.
Thank you, Dina. So Albert, Samira, Dina, I'm going to sort of pick some of the questions that are filtering into our chat box and pose them to sort of one of you in particular. However, if I pose a different one, please feel free to sort of offer your thoughts to one that has not been explicitly directed to you as well. Equally, if you really just don't like the idea of the question that I've posed to you, feel free to just ignore it and sort of answer as you please. But Albert, I'd actually like to sort of hear you expand on a series of thoughts that you began, like centered on Thomas from Oxfam's question on what the specific role of humanitarian organizations like his is in helping to forward and push through climate adaptation in these conflict and non-state group settings. As he very correctly points out, humanitarian organizations doing explicitly humanitarian work have sometimes strong records of operating in these spaces, but when engaged in more explicitly climate-related work, that record is a lot spottier, to put it kindly and euphemistically. So how do you see this role?
Yeah, good question. I think, we're living in a time where humanitarians are increasingly being asked to do a lot more, right, with a lot fewer resources. There's been this kind of, multi-mandate organizations like Oxfam and many others have been able to do the type of classic humanitarian response work that prioritizes humanitarian objectives, but also then support more of the kind of longer term development and peacebuilding work. But I think purely humanitarian organizations have, in different ways, reacted to these calls for humanitarians to do more. But I think in the same way that peace builders have been increasingly thinking about, well, we need to start doing peace building in a way that is, has positive impacts on environmental issues, and that brings together win-wins across the kind of climate conflict divide. I think humanitarians are also increasingly starting to think about, or many have been implementing humanitarian programs in ways that not just respond to displacement and humanitarian needs caused by climate change or the compounding impacts of climate change and conflict, but that also try to address some of the root causes. And I think, I myself have seen examples in places like Kenya, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Somalia, where NGOs doing humanitarian work, particularly in like protracted crises, in areas of protracted displacement, using kind of nature-based solutions to help IDPs and host communities together, for example, do reforestation projects, or to use new types of agricultural techniques that are less water intensive, or in areas of flooding, like, a project I was involved in South Sudan. IOM very innovatively kind of used flooded areas where the waterlogging was happening over like 3, 4, 5 years to start doing rice production. And so, helping people to adapt in ways that also addresses their immediate humanitarian needs, but sets the foundation for increasing community resilience and adaptation to climate change. It can definitely be done. I think it's one of these things that it's relatively new, and I think community organizations probably need to be sharing more of what they're doing with each other. And I think a lot more research and evaluations on the programs that are working and on what is and what isn't working, I think would also be very helpful. But yeah, I think there's definitely bandwidth. But yes, I think there's a lot being asked of humanitarian organizations to do, adding kind of climate sensitive, not just climate sensitive, but climate positive demands on their work. I'm sure won't be easy for them to adopt, especially if they don't have the resources to do it. So yeah, not an easy one.
Excellent. Thank you, Albert. Samira, I'm going to ask you a question posed by our friend and colleague Seb at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. And he highlights a recent article in the New Humanitarian, which makes the case that Al-Shabaab are not just a non-state group that must be dealt with, but that they are, certainly relative to the federal government, possibly a superior actor to engage with from the point of view of environmental protection and perhaps climate action. What would you make of this line of argument and discussion?
Yeah, I think I was just clicking on the link to the article. I think it raises the kind of uncomfortable question that in this field we need to grapple with more honestly. I would want to take that argument seriously because it aligns with what we found on the ground. Our research confirms that Al-Shabaab has embedded environmental protection into formal governance agreements with clans. For instance, in 2022 with the Saleban clan in a place called Galmudug, they explicitly included some environmental protection provisions. Their ban on tree cutting and charcoal production, stuff like that. And so they could be having a meaningful impact in halting deforestation in a country where I think the statistic is we lose about nearly 5% of our tree cover. We've lost nearly 5% of our tree cover in 2 decades. I think this is 3 times the rate in the region. So we've had the same thing that the article is reporting, that people are privately saying that Al-Shabaab's governance is more predictable, is more efficient, and in some ways more responsive than the federal government. But I would say that it also, our research also complicates the picture in ways because they are not doing this for the right reasons or to protect the communities, but it's more opportunistic and in line with how they would want to appear at that specific time, and also their capacities are limited. And so I would say it's something that maybe needs much more research.
And Dina, I'm going to bundle 2 questions into one for you. I mean, from a community perspective, what kinds of climate and environmental action in Yemen, and again, speaking in gross generalizations here, but what kinds of actions do most communities deem to be most necessary? And simultaneously, what kinds of sort of climate adaptation are they most capable of contributing to themselves, again, in these sort of climate non-state group contexts?
Thank you. Yes. So in terms of Yemen and the context, I think one thing is to their role in mediation. I think that is actually quite key because they're the ones who have been leading on that for whether it's for climate change or otherwise. The other one is in relation to civ-mil dialogues. I think this is an area that we have not explored fully. Given that, for example, security forces, when they are involved, it can also cause further conflicts in communities. So the question is, how can community groups sort of take a lead role in relation to civ-mil dialogues where issues and concerns can be aired openly and be resolved between the security forces who are in charge of certain localities and the communities that they're supposed to be serving. So that's the second one. And I think the third one is in relation to early warning. Specifically, I think we don't really have enough of early warning mechanisms that communities can take a lead role in, specifically also around the tribal mechanisms, for example, that exist in relation to early warning. Can we perhaps see how communities can take a lead role in that? And I think the fourth one is the connection between the early warning and humanitarian response, because and it also links up to your question earlier around the nexus. I think we're not the nexus itself. Now, when we speak about it, we should also include climate response and climate change into it, so that we link up early warning with humanitarian response and also with development and peace, given the mediation angle that communities take a role in.
Thank you. So I have a question that I'm really going to pose to all three of you, and please feel free to take it in sort of slightly different directions, and that's about the finance component. And I think we're all more or less on the same page that, well, non-state groups must be engaged in some capacity when it comes to climate action. And yet, even if one accepts that, and even if a certain number of international interlocutors are also on board with that idea, you're still left with often tremendous, often insurmountable challenges that come with actually getting the money to those most in need of it. We have tremendous banking restrictions, we have an array of other challenges. How, in Somali contexts, in Yemeni contexts, in international contexts more broadly, how could or should we go about dealing with that particular problem? Whoever would like to take it up first.
May I just quickly just say that I think, yes, I think finance is obviously is an issue. However, I don't think as international community, we have not done enough in terms of just piloting some response that can actually showcase how can this actually be done in reality. And I think the sort of the lack of finance or the lack of eagerness from donors is primarily because they have not seen how this can actually work in practice. And here I would really want to see, like I mentioned, in terms of the nexus, how can we have a consortium perhaps of humanitarian, peace building, climate related actors and development as well, who can work in consortiums. And perhaps there is, in terms of funding, the dipping into developmental finance. I think that is something where we're more likely to find support. But I think, we have not given enough evidence to the donors to say, this is a pilot that we have done in 2-3 countries, and this is the likely outcome. And I think it's the onus is on us to do that.
And just before quickly turning to Samira and Albert, so I believe we have actually set aside an hour and a half for today's discussion. I can already see that some of you have perhaps thought it's an hour, and I'm sure we would contentedly continue this discussion for many hours yet. However, we don't need to use our full allotment of time, and we can sort of slowly perhaps sort of bring things towards a conclusion if people are starting to drift off. So with that having been said, if people don't have more questions to put in the chat box, and please do contribute a few there if there are key parts of this discussion that you would still like to add. But Dina, Albert, Samira, in addition to sort of posing this current question to you, I would also like to sort of have you putting a little bit of thought into a few kind of parting remarks that you'd like to leave us with, a few additional suggestions as to what we, most of whom are engaged in different parts of the climate, humanitarian and security worlds, ought to be taking forward, and equally just whatever other broad parts of this massive question we've yet to really touch on. But anyway, Samira, please.
Yeah, thanks. I want to agree with, I think, Thomas in the chat and also my colleague from Somalia that there is that fundamental disconnect where, climate finance flow through the states, and most climate vulnerable communities are living under armed group control specifically for Somalia. And this is what our research is showing. So these programs are actively avoiding conflict affected areas to reduce risks, obviously. And so these populations are being systematically excluded from this adaptation funding. Humanitarian organizations are the obvious bridge, and they have tried, they have access, they have the community trust, they have that experience in contested areas. We found that also Somali-led and diaspora-funded initiatives are also able to negotiate access where international actors specifically can't. But if they also face challenges from the other side, I think in our research, there was one diaspora-funded borehole project that had to prove to Al-Shabaab that it was not getting its finances from a Western government, and they had to prove through, Dahabshil, which is a remittance company, transfer records that they were not externally funded by donors. So I think they face challenges from both sides, but they do really try. And then another issue that we do have is that humanitarian funding cycles are built for emergency response, and we need sustained investment in climate adaptation. And that funding base, as it is already collapsing now that we know that the US suspended assistance to Somalia sometime early in the year. And then also we know with a lot of other financing being diverted to so many other crises around the world. So I think the system needs to change. It needs to meet local actors halfway. We need to have dedicated windows for fragile settings, simplified access, longer horizons than, this one-year projects, and then flexibility to work through these non-state channels like the diaspora, for instance, rather than requiring everything to flow through the central government. And especially in places like Somalia, where a lot of the population is still under Al-Shabaab, what we're telling them is that they have to wait for the state to get to them before they can adapt to the crises that we're constantly facing.
Albert.
Yeah, I mean, I've Dina and Samira have kind of answered it very eloquently. I think all I can add is we are seeing climate financing to fragile and conflict states increasing. It is going up. However, it is going up at a ridiculously lower speed than climate financing overall. But I think that shows that the arguments that are being made, the advocacy by different types of organizations, by different communities, that more of this needs to go to fragile states is working. However, that it's been quite a blunt instrument, right? More funding needs to go to fragile states. And I think Samira just said it very well there, that even within money going to fragile states, there needs to be some allocation that goes not through the government, right? So, and this might be, but then there's, and it overlaps with humanitarian imperative around localization, for example. So that more of this funding needs to not just go to NGOs and UN agencies that are probably well placed, and humanitarian organizations that are well placed to work in non-state areas or areas beyond state control, but to support local civil society organizations to do it themselves, to help communities do it themselves. And that might take creativity about how do you actually get the money to them, right? And I think the example that Samira mentioned around Al-Shabaab checking, so they allowed a borehole project to go ahead, but they wanted to make sure it didn't come from a Western government. But maybe funding can be done then through the diaspora. Maybe it can be done through diaspora organizations. Maybe it can, maybe local communities can negotiate with these groups, even if the funding is coming from a global fund. If it kind of can benefit them, if they can use it for their political advantage, they might allow it. But then there's a question of, well, then is climate financing being claimed by Al-Shabaab as something of their own? And then it raises questions of like, well, if they're doing this humanitarian aid anyway, is there a difference? Are we willing to tolerate the risk? Does this convey legitimacy to the group when they kind of will do a kind of comms, propaganda around it? And if the answer is yes, and we're not willing to tolerate that, then I think we need to find creative ways. And I think that's it. There is experimentation happening out there. I think some of it just needs to be better documented, better shared. And part of what we're trying to do with this project is to capture where is the good practice, and how can we learn across different disciplines. So, as I mentioned earlier, peace builders and are increasingly working on this, and this is literally being organized by the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. So environmental peacebuilding is really all about how do we use environmental entry points and climate-related entry points for peace. But what about how can we use humanitarian and peace entry points for climate change? And, I think we just need to all be collaborating and sharing a lot more. And I think it would probably be helpful if the environmental peace building side of the house engage more with the humanitarian side of the house, for example. Even if humanitarians don't want to be seen to be doing peace building, they probably have the local networks and knowledge about communities and the operational knowledge about how to get funding to those areas that perhaps peace builders may not have, particularly if they're only working on kind of intercommunal conflict and not the more political conflict that might include or might involve armed groups. So I think that's my parting thought is, despite me not liking the HDP nexus as a term, I do think we just need to work. There does just need to be more sharing, collaboration, and continue advocacy jointly from the climate and the peace building and the humanitarian side with the big climate funds and funders of climate change work to not just allocate funding in a blanket manner to conflict areas, but to then really go at the subnational level and have even more specialized windows dedicated that have a higher risk tolerance and that spend the money through local organizations and through perhaps other different mechanisms.
Thank you. So I'm going to solicit final sort of parting thoughts from the three of you, beginning with Dina. And among those parting thoughts, I'd be grateful if you could sort of give us your take on where you think we need to, and also simultaneously where you think we are going to take things from here. Like what are next steps? And secondly, I mean, of course, there can be a tendency to sort of forever try and reinvent the wheel. And this feels especially true in the context of climate adaptation. While in reality, it sort of feels so much of the time as if we know what needs to be done. We just lack the boldness and the willingness and the political will to sort of engineer these changes. So if that is indeed the case, what can we, those of us sitting in cities and capitals that are kind of supposedly that little bit closer to the levers of power, what could we do to sort of try and unstick things from this side? So,
yes. Yeah, thank you very much. No, I think one thing, and also to allude to one of the points that Albert mentioned, and this is, I see as one of the stumbling blocks that we face, is that the risk of the image that we are somehow legitimizing armed actors on the ground. I think this is really one of the big obstacles to moving forward. But I think we need to take a leaf from the work that we do in the humanitarian setting, and that is to think around, when we support communities, we support them irrespective of which armed actor is on the ground. So we are able in the humanitarian setting to look away or not consider the identity of the armed actors in question. But when it comes to climate change and climate adaptation, we somehow not able to do that. And I think it's really crucial that we identify climate change and climate adaptation and also climate conflict as life-saving. These are life-saving interventions. And for that purpose, I think we need to ensure that we deal with it as a priority, and that also there are opportunities to capitalize on the current situation. But we will not be able to do so if we politicize climate change and climate adaptation.
Thank you. Samira.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think I agree with both Albert and Dina on this point about, dealing with non-state armed actors and Al-Shabaab in this case. Al-Shabaab is not a bystander to the climate crisis. It's actually an active actor, a governance actor that's shaping who can adapt and how they do it. So we can't really design effective climate adaptation while ignoring this reality. Second is that there are some benefits from them, from the environmental governance, but these are very fragile. Their tree cutting bans are slowing deforestation. Their plastic bans also are quite effective in their areas. Though they're driven by military self-interest, not community welfare, we do need to notice that we need to know that there is some fragile gains. If the strategic calculation changes, that might change. The benefit might disappear. But for now, we just need to get them to work with communities on how to cope better, the coping mechanisms that they're losing. And then on the third aspect is something that you mentioned is that Western aid is collapsing, regional conflicts are increasing, especially in the Horn of Africa, and so these communities that are living under Al-Shabaab are now getting more and more exposed to climate change and are becoming more isolated because of this less programming when it comes to this. So I would say we have to begin to deal with the realities that exist in our region and start to work with communities, local organizations, diaspora networks, business community. I think Somalia's diaspora is actually quite effective in working with communities on the ground as entry points to solving some of these challenges that we have. But we need the financing and the frameworks that we can work through, not the short-term cycles, but really a longer-term programmatic cycles like 5 years. Thank you so much.
Albert, parting thoughts.
Honestly, not much to add. I just want to thank everyone and thank yourself, Dina and Samira, for the really interesting discussion. I really think we need to continue to beat the drum that more climate financing does need to go to fragile and conflict-affected states, but integrate into that a call for nuance, a call for us to move beyond, the term fragile and conflict-affected states as a monolith, and to understand that the diversity of situations of fragility and conflict, and that climate financing needs to adapt to those, because or else really, we're risking leaving millions of people behind, and not meeting our climate goals. And I think that would really, just changing the way we think and adapting our mechanisms for funding and programming in these areas is crucial. And I think the best way to do that advocacy and to integrate that call for a changed and nuanced approach is the crucial thing is evidence. And so I think, really capturing lessons learned from where this is being done, where experiments are happening, where pilots are happening, using that to encourage donors to do more piloting, to have more funding go through local organizations, civil society organizations, and to include in that evaluations, so I think it all kind of comes together. In many ways, this is just about doing programming better and to really implementing the localization agenda. So again, it already goes with the grain and follows the momentum of big global commitments that have already been made. So I think it's just helping kind of really make that happen in a nuanced and locally adaptive way. But yeah, thank you again.
So thank you, Albert. Thank you, Samira. Thank you, Dina. Please keep an eye out on the website of the Centre on Armed Groups for the research that the three of them and others have painstakingly put together in the last months. Please also keep an eye out on the Environmental Peacebuilding Association website. We've got a series of additional events as part of the Road to Ottawa, and certainly hope to see as many of you as possible in Canada for the conference in June. So thanks again for tuning in. We look forward to continuing the discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks.